It's Tuesday, May 27th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. I hope everybody had a good Memorial Day weekend. I got to start the summer off with a little bit of sunshine. I took my first day off really in 5 months, and you know what? It was pretty nice, but that's also why you didn't get an episode yesterday. But that is the past, and today is now. And today on the show, Democrats get their report card, and it's going to be a pretty awkward parent-teacher conference. The Democratic Party finally got their 2024 election autopsy, and it is a doozy. I'll break all that down, plus some new polling about what voters currently think about who Democrats are and what they're all about, and who's in charge. But first, make sure you're following on whatever podcast app you listen to this on, or subscribe there to Make It Make Sense with Granthermes on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Like and subscribe on YouTube, and sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where tomorrow morning I'll have a new article all about J.D. Vance's big sit-down interview with the New York Times that got overshadowed by the news in Congress we talked about last week. But we still need to talk about this interview because some of it is bonkers. That will only, however, be for paid subscribers. It's just $5 to get access to that and all the great content I've got up on the Substack. Otherwise, continue to share the show on social media. If you like what you hear here, it's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. All right, let's get to our main story today. Democrats get a wake-up call. So, last week, in all the chaos that was the big, beautiful bill making its way through the House of Representatives, another story got put on the back burner. The political analytics firm Catalyst finally put out its report about the 2024 election. It's what's known in the political world as an election autopsy. What went wrong, how it happened, and what should happen next. Catalyst is a left-of-center firm, which is why a lot of Democratic Party insiders and political observers were anxious to see what they would say in this report. And frankly, it was out a little later than expected. Usually, the party that loses an election gets a report like this in the early spring, not Memorial Day weekend, but here we are. And what was in this report was a lot of evidence that American voters are fleeing the Democratic Party, something Democrats and the rest of us could see happening in real time over the summer. A lot of the evidence in this report are things that I talked about over the summer, especially during the campaign, but also since the election. But to have it all combined in one place was really stunning to see. At nearly every breakdown of how you look at voters, age, race, gender, college education, which kind of means income, sort of, and geography, it was pretty much all bad news for Democrats. The report finding, quote, while shifts in turnout were an important factor in Trump's victory, some demographic groups also saw significant declines in Democratic support from 2020 to 2024, adding Harris lost the most among an interconnected set of groups: people of color, young voters, men, and irregular voters. Now, it's important to say here that taking these groups individually doesn't always give you a complete picture of things like race or age, and can frequently intersect and influence other areas like how you vote. And the authors of this report note that too, although those things are not meant to be scapegoats for failing these groups. And it also certainly doesn't make it any easier for Democrats to swallow what was in this report, because when you look at the breakdown of the battleground states, the ones that matter the most in presidential elections, the results were mixed at best among those states, where Democrats gained with white and Latino voters by, in some cases, less than a percentage point, depending on how you broke those down. And they lost Black and AAPI voters by more than they gained in the other groups of voters. And when you zoom out to the national level, it was worse. Overall, across the country, Democrats lost 1% of the white vote compared to 2020, 3% of the Latino vote, nearly 6% of the Black vote, and nearly 7% of the AAPI vote. Of the four groups in that list, Latino, Black, and AAPI voters have been reliably Democratic for decades. And while I do want to make it clear here, too, that communities of color aren't monoliths and people have lots of reasons for voting the way they do and the way they don't, these are huge drops in support and are certainly not what Democrats can afford right now. And those huge drops were really apparent when you looked at men versus women. Now, I've talked about this before on the show, that the gap between who men vote for and who women vote for hit an all-time high in 2024, with more men voting for Trump and women voting against him, though not necessarily for Harris, which is an important factor here in all of these categories. Now, overall, Democrats lost 5 points with men and dropped a point with women. Again, both negative numbers, neither of which the party wants to see. And like the previous numbers, those got worse when you broke it down by race, with 8% of black men leaving the Democrats compared to 1% of black women. That was 12% to 7% for Latino men versus women, and 6% to 3% for Asian men and women. And that gap got worse the younger you looked. The gap between Gen Z women and Gen Z men was nearly 17%, meaning the Democrats lost almost 1 in 5 Gen Z men compared to how many of them voted in 2020. Among other generations, that number was still bad, but it was about 1 in 10. And finally, we get to the way Democrats like to slice up the electorate most of the time, which is by education, because consistently, they could count on voters with at least some college education to vote for them. And while that mostly remained true, they still lost 3% of voters, while the number of non-college educated voters has continued to leave the party, with about an 11% gap between the two groups, while the numbers of both groups who say they support Democrats is shrinking. And so in the end, what this autopsy found was something that I have talked about on the show and other political minds have seen, is that the party is increasingly becoming a party where the main support is coming from young, college-educated women. And while there's nothing wrong with wanting their support and courting those voters, they just aren't enough to win elections. And as the report notes, they aren't the main voters in the states known as the Blue Wall of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which were named that because if Democrats could win those states for a long time, it meant they could win the election without having to win any other battleground states. And increasingly, it just doesn't look like those states are going to be enough to win elections going forward, and they might not even be all that reliable. But in the end, these autopsy reports are also supposed to give some sort of prescription for what to do next, to bring the party back from the dead. And this really didn't have that. Apart from pointing out that reaching voters, especially younger ones, is more complex than it's ever been. You've probably heard a lot about people looking for a Joe Rogan of the left and wanting someone to enter the podcast space for liberals. And we even got some news this past week that the Democratic National Party was trying to give some people some money to start a podcast that would aim at that kind of thing, even though that's sort of antithetical to how these operations actually work. But that's a different conversation, because in this autopsy, there was nothing about the message that Democrats are putting out there and nothing about what to do about it. So even if they could find a Joe Rogan of the left, the things that lost them voters in 2024 would still be the same things that these podcasts would be saying. And overall, this report just seems to sort of shrug and say, we don't know what to do. And now there was never going to be a silver bullet for Democrats to fix what happened in 2024, especially as the structures within the party, the people who were there, remain mostly the same, something that I'll talk about here in a minute. But this autopsy was really unhelpful and really only served to make for some more confusion out there, because just a week before we got this report, there was another poll that came out from the Republican polling firm Echelon that asked voters of all kinds across the political spectrum to describe the Democratic Party in one word, and it was not good for Democrats. The top words were weak, corrupt, and liberal, and they didn't mean liberal in a good way. And yes, there were words like fair and good and democracy, but also ineffective, crooked, and unsure. And for a party trying to find itself, its leaders, and a new path forward, none of those are positives. When you put those sentiments together with the exodus of voters from the Democratic Party and the conversation about the cover-up of Joe Biden's health problems during the end of his term, you get a really bad landscape for Democrats right now. And again, this isn't new. I and many, many others have been talking about this for months, that the party seems directionless. Voters who are leaving the party are angry at leadership, and also no one truly seems in charge or to have a lot of ambition to make a change. And that gets us to the conversations happening right now after this report, because to find a way out of the wilderness, Democrats need to anoint a new leader, and that means having a tough conversation about the people currently in power. While the Democratic Party has a wider spread in age compared to Republicans and a younger median age, control of the Democratic Party remains with the older generations in both the House and the Senate, which is something you can't exactly say for the Republican Party. And to make matters worse, of the last 10 members of Congress to die in office, which is also kind of an unheard of number, 8 of them have been Democrats. And that has kicked this conversation about whether members who are older need to step aside or whether they should be forced out into overdrive, because it's not like it's Republicans who have been dropping like flies. And so far, there hasn't been anyone to step up and lead. There have been flashes. Cory Booker with his filibuster, California Governor Gavin Newsom with his new podcast trying to reach across the aisle and be that Joe Rogan of the left, or even the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders rallies in red states across the country, but none of those have really moved voters nor seem to give the party a good direction forward. And people are noticing that. A new poll asked people who they thought the new face of the Democrats was, and 26% said it was Ocasio-Cortez, while the same percentage said it was no one, with everybody else struggling to break double digits, except for Bernie Sanders, who got 12%, but that's nothing. That's not consensus. There is no leader right now. And the notion that AOC could be the future face of the party and its leadership has really bothered a lot of older members, as this has continually come up, not just in that poll, but it's been something that's been in the water supply for a while. They see her as too outspoken when it comes to criticizing the party itself. She used to be considered one of the most liberal members, but she's not talked about in those terms anymore. She's done a lot to distance herself from quite a bit of that and has been mostly a team player in the last few years, trying to line herself up for a leadership position that she's been denied. And that's really because a lot of these older members of Congress don't want to turn their power over to a younger generation of members of Congress. And I think that's the takeaway from all of this. The autopsy not having a good answer to how to fix the party's problems, the way people feel about Democrats right now, why they're leaving the party, and how leaderless this entire thing is, all comes from the people at the top not wanting to change or not knowing how to, even if they did, because in the end they know that it would mean having to give up some of their power. And this conversation is by no means over. There are 524 days until the midterm elections in 2026. And it means that the clock is ticking for Democrats to make a choice on whether they're going to fail their voters once again, or whether the next time there is an election autopsy, a report card for how they're doing, if they're going to make the grade. Okay, that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show, whatever podcast app you listen to this on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new video episodes. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack. Like I said at the top, it is just $5 a month for all this great bonus content I'm putting up there all the time. And if you don't want to do that, no worries. But please share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Granthermes on X and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.